This show is brought to you by SalCal Real Estate Connections. Welcome to the Telescope View. We're here tonight with the author of The Final Revelation of the Sun Project, Rick Teles, and of course, special guest tonight, Kat Kennedy, the author of Under Thunder Mountain and UFO Enthusiast. And Pat, we're glad to have you here tonight.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys. I'm looking forward to hearing it.
And tonight's show, Rick, is our third show about Roswell, kind of wrap things up. But tonight is very important because we're going to talk about what has transpired here in the past 72 years since this crash. And believe me, there's plenty to talk about.
Yeah, I think the question is, what have we learned in the last 70 years or so? I mean, there's been a lot of people out there who believe that some of the technology that we have today actually had its roots in what was found in the Roswell Desert in 1947. And it seems that there's no coincidence that in the years following Roswell, there were major leaps in technology that previously had stalled. I mean, there were some other companies, General Electric and whatever, they were doing technologies, working with things like perhaps fiber optics and that type of thing, but they were stalled and they were getting nowhere. And so is it coincidence that right after Roswell, these things took off? And we're going to talk a little bit about that, and some of the people who were involved or over the last 70 years have said something or have indicated that we knew. We gained a lot of knowledge from Roswell.
Now tell me something about Alan Hynek, because I've seen this name pop up a lot of times.
The what? I'm sorry.
Alan Hynek.
Alan Hynek, yes, J. Allen Hynek. Now, a lot of people know J. Allen Hynek, and he was an astronomer, a professor from Northwestern, but he's probably best known for his role with Project Blue Book. Actually, he came on, first we had Project Sign, then we had Project Grudge, then we had Project Blue Book. And he was the consultant for Project Blue Book, and initially he was brought on because he was a skeptic. And his job was to explain away all these things that people were seeing. I know a lot of people have heard or believe that Project Blue Book was top secret. Actually, it wasn't. Project Sign and Project Grudge were more secret. Project Blue Book was really a public relations program to try and
Smooth over,
explain what all these UFOs are about. How does he get, and he changed over the years, and in the 60s he started to become a believer. He said, I can't explain these things away anymore. But what does he have to do with Roswell? Well, the connection with Roswell is in the 70s, Hynek started to hypothesize that maybe what we're seeing here may not be interstellar, they might be interdimensional travelers. He hypothesized that that possibly even some of these things that we see flying around could be living matter. And he also considered that some of these might be drones. And in fact, that idea came out in the movie Close Encounter of the Third Kind, which he was a consultant for.
Oh, interesting.
When they were all at the mountain at Devil's Tower. And if you listen, they'll say, we monitor no biologics at this time.
Yeah.
So they were saying that all those were
the
grays. Drones.
The grays are.
And if they were grays, they were not biologics. In '75, along with Jacques Vallée, he advocated that hypothesis in a progress report called The Edge of Reality. And at that point, he said pretty much that these spacecraft might be alive. And again, that's what we reported. That's what I learned from the people I talked to, and we wrote it in the book, that the design of these craft were alive by human standards and were in fact what we call dragonflies. There was nothing in them, but they were alive and they flew. And then there were others that contained the grays, like the ship at Roswell, which would be then codenamed Enigma. But the interesting thing here is, at Roswell, they talked about the construction of the ship after the fact and the construction of these grays that were in fact biologically created entities, but that their skin, and at the time they said they were suits, but we later learned that that was skin they were on. It was a living matter, and so was the skin of the ship. That some of that metal they had was actually living matter.
Well, how did they determine that? They used this kind of reverse engineering. What exactly, what is that process?
Well, they were doing reverse engineering. Now, in the 40s and the 50s, they had no way to reverse engineer it because they didn't understand it.
Right.
They looked at the line, it looked like fishing line, which was fiber optics. They tried to bend the metal, which they couldn't do. This was actually later on, when you're starting to get in the Corso days, which we're going to talk about, in the 60s, in the 70s, our technology advanced, so now we could reverse engineer and try to understand what some of it was. So basically, Hynek took his lead from what was found at Roswell. A lot of people didn't know that, but he was basically, as he studied some of this, he was saying, well, wait a minute, this appears to be living matter. Is that possible? And what we now know today, based on some of our experiments and some of the technology that we have, is yeah, it is. And we're going to talk about that as we move forward. We got to kind of get into the story of Colonel Philip Corso. But the connection with Hynek is that he was already thinking along these lines based on information he was gleaning from Roswell.
I see.
That maybe this type of technology is possible. And he said that to that effect, there may be an intelligence somewhere else in the world, even interdimensionally, that has the technology to build these things.
Well, what is really interesting, in the beginning, he was not a believer.
He was not until the 60s.
But as time went on, he said, you know what, there's something to this, and this is real.
Well, he got upset. He goes, I can't keep explaining some of these things as swamp gas. He goes, it just doesn't make any sense.
Swamp gas.
Okay, and we know that swamp gas exists, and if you've ever seen it, yeah, it can glow, but it doesn't look like some of the things that were being reported. Plus, he was talking to people that you didn't always hear about, the pilots, the high-level people who were saying, I saw this. You know, and we're talking at that period of time, you're talking about combat veterans from World War II who saw it all, and now they're flying planes saying, I've never seen anything like this. And we weren't at the point where our technology in your late 40s, early 50s, we really were just getting into the skunk works and people like Kelly Johnson and the U-2, so they weren't seeing that type of aircraft.
So in reality, when they were doing blue up back then, it was more a public thing.
It was a public relations thing.
You didn't see the real information coming from pilots and this kind of people.
You may hear a little bit, but you didn't hear too much. A lot of them didn't want to report. So we didn't, the real top secret ones, and I've mentioned this before, never go to any of these programs.
Right.
And they never go to anything you're going to hear. I mean, the top secret stuff that happens either today goes back, pilot gets debriefed, it goes to the base intelligence sends it to Air Force intelligence or whatever, so on and so forth. And then finally it might get to a group like Flight 9, who is still supposedly the tops of the tops when it comes to this stuff. And you know, people say, well, there's no such thing as Flight 9. We never heard of them. Well, you never heard of Able Danger before before 9/11 either, did you?
Right.
But they're out there. So
They're out there.
Right.
So, of course, our next famous person on this matter is Philip Corso.
we're moving along the line here, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So the next one we have is, we have Colonel Philip Corso. We've spoken about him. He wrote a book called The Day After Roswell. He was on the staff of President Eisenhower's National Security Council. He's a decorated war veteran. And again, when he was doing some of this work, he was a major. So he was subsequently promoted, so he must have been doing something right.
Yeah.
But in 1997, we'll just go back over that, he wrote a book called The Day After Roswell. And in that book, he said that it was his job to help reverse engineer extraterrestrial artifacts recovered from the crash near Roswell in 1947. And that was interesting because we're talking about that leap in technology now.
Big leap, big leap.
He worked with people like General Electric. He worked with people like University of California, Pasadena, what became the Jet Propulsion Lab. He worked with groups, some of these secret groups that we hear today, at Stanford and whatever. And he said that they didn't always know where this stuff came from when he gave it to them.
That's right. They really didn't know that really was from this incident.
No, and according to him, the reverse engineering of these artifacts led directly to the development of accelerated particle beams, fiber optics, lasers, integrated circuits, and we have all those today in Kevlar. And what I have up on the screen here is, as we talk about Roswell, what Roswell may have given us, the top picture up here, these are fiber optics. And fiber optics come in different sizes, different thicknesses. But if you remember what Marcel said, Colonel Jesse, Major Marcel at the time, but then Colonel Marcel, when he found this stuff at Roswell.
Called the fishing line.
Right,
Yeah,
in 78, when he talked about it, he goes, it looked like fishing line. Now back then, he wouldn't have been able to describe that as a fishing line because the fishing line was more of a cord. But then he described it as fishing line, but in 78, nobody really knew much about fiber optics. He certainly didn't. But now we can see how what he was looking at here could in fact look like fishing line. He spoke about lighted things, such as Corso spoke about things like lasers. Now, Marcel knew nothing about this. He spoke about some odd things that they found, but now we have lasers.
They didn't have lasers at that time in our history. Is that
40s,
correct?
no, I mean,
Not even hidden in the most hidden places of our.
they were starting to work with them, but they're hitting roadblocks.
I mean,
Einstein came up with the concept of lasers well before that.
even Corso, they thought they found flashlights
Right.
in the craft.
Right.
When in reality, they were actually lasers.
They were lasers.
Lasers.
Laser is light amplified through stimulated emission of radiation. And it's really just using usually some type of, the first lasers were ruby lasers, and it actually, the light would be going through a ruby, and that would,
Wow.
and that would squeeze the lasers down. Now we have gas lasers like argon lasers and different types of lasers. Blu-ray is actually a laser. And the reason you have a Blu-ray disc is that laser can read more data in a single pass than a red laser, which you might have seen on an older one.
You know, it's funny when we're talking about the lasers and everything, and you flash back at what we sent up in the space probe when we sent up that disc.
Yep.
And it was all, what was that?
Well, actually, that was, I mean, I think that was
Music?
gold, but it could be a
Music?
laser disc.
It was a laser, right?
Yeah. But he talked about microprocessors that they came from Roswell, the fiber optics lasers, night vision. Corso was talking about night vision. And again, that's another type of optics. And we were seeing a lot of type of optics on this Roswell crafter. That's what Marcel described. And we also, he believed that we got the night vision. Microwaves.
Microwaves.
Okay? They found some communication devices. They didn't know what they were, and it wasn't until many, many years later they started to understand that these were microwaves. Where do we use microwaves?
Yeah, think about that one.
I know, right?
Okay? We use microwaves in the kitchen,
In the
obviously.
kitchen.
These are microwaves. And everybody has seen a cell tower. Microwaves are used for cell communications over short distances, tower to tower.
Tower to tower.
Okay? But we use microwaves. Now, they believe we're going to use the microwave, different parts of the microwave spectrum, possibly for space communications. So we're going to see more of that. Now, the point I'm going to make is, how do we know that some of this stuff maybe came from there? Well, when I was putting this together, I talked to some people, and they shared something with me. They shared something with me called a program that they heard about subsequent to all this, which was even later than Marcel and more into the 90s, called Harvest.
Harvest.
And they believe that Harvest had something to do with the harvesting of technology and growing technology. And these people said to me, every now and then we'd heard a reference to a thing called the boneyard, or the boneyards. And they believe that the boneyards were places where the Roswell technology had been left, maybe even Rome, New York, up at the old Griffiths Air Force Base, which we talked about many times. So that's why they believe a number of these things that we're seeing here is actually part of the Roswell legacy, as they call it. We have memory metals.
Right.
We have those today. Sometimes they're called metallic glass, but we have memory metals. And if you remember at Roswell, they would fold up the metal. It would come back out perfectly smooth. They couldn't
Right.
break it. It was extremely light. They couldn't tear it. They couldn't burn it.
Couldn't scratch it.
And we're using that today. We have memory metals. Some of them go into things like carbon nanotubes, which existed in nature, but we never knew anything about them. Optical data storage, which I don't have that up here, but we have optical data storage. Now, we're all familiar with optical discs and that type of thing, but we're talking about a data storage beyond that. And I'm going to mention that in the next one when we get to some of the stuff that DARPA's doing and ATIP has been
materials.
doing.
Oh,
Right?
The living materials.
Organic material.
That's what I'm seeing, the organic material. That's got to
They
be what
found
that is.
what they believed was organic material at Roswell. All right. Now that's a whole new ballgame. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But they believe that the skin of these grays were actually a grown organic material or chemically created, and that the skin of the craft was actually an organic material. And we're actually working with that stuff today on airplanes. We know that some of the stuff that they're creating is organic because they want it to be able to heal itself. They want it to be able to communicate.
Could you imagine fixing itself after it's had a problem?
And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about.
I mean, in medicine, that would be just like awesome.
We're doing
for
that.
sure.
We're creating skin. They do
Right.
that at University of Pennsylvania, I believe, do that for burns.
Just beautiful stuff with that.
And you know how we're doing that? 3D printers.
Yeah,
3D printers, right.
We're doing this. So we have these tremendous leaps. And when we talk about microprocessors, something I know a little bit about. I worked with a lot of that stuff, and I know we used to progress, and they used to be, you'd have the mechanical gates, they'd be magnetic or whatever, and the gate would open and close, and that's the circuit's either on or off. That's a 0 or 1. But now they talk about ion gates, and they talk about DNA-based gates. That's huge jumps in technology that a lot of people say, how did we learn that? And others are coming back like these men saying, that was part of the Harvest program. We're being helped with that.
Propulsion. I mean, in today's propulsion, where would we be, Rick, without Roswell? Tell me.
Well, that has, again, we're looking at how did these things move. And in Roswell, we started to believe, and this wasn't in the 40s or the 50s, this was later on, 60s, we started to believe more in the electromagnetic fields and how they work. Not just the propulsion of the craft, but the way it actually was operated. Okay, now we get into stuff, and we talked about this for a while. People say, you're crazy, that's science fiction, it sounds great. And then the ATIP documents came out.
Right.
Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program with the Pentagon, that came out.
38 secrets. That's more than
There's
that.
more.
Right?
There's 3 more that I came up with.
From a Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah.
Could you imagine?
They shared the ones that they wanted to share.
Right.
Again, I know from these people that whatever the Congress asks for, we'll give them these 38. They'll be happy. They'll go away. They'll go into another room and do whatever they do.
Keep them busy for a while
There were
with
3
those
more.
38.
There were 3 more that we talked about. But the list that came out, and a lot of people say reads like something out of sci-fi fantasy, and it does. I mean, I was a little surprised at some of them. I had heard of things like this, but I never thought we were making any inroads into that. And a lot of them now are questioning from where the inspiration for this technology came, and they believe it's all going to be traced back to the Roswell's, to the Roswell crash and Corso's work. All right. So what do we have? Well, we have the Defense Intelligence Agency, and what is the stuff they came up with? What have they been working with? The Defense Intelligence Agency is ATIP. They're the ones who own ATIP. All right, the Pentagon doesn't own it. This group does it. Now, the Defense Intelligence Agency, they handle all intelligence for all the armed services. Plus, they handle all the surveillance satellites. That's all theirs.
Oh.
Okay, they do all that stuff.
Yep.
So, what are they working on? Pulsed high-power microwave technology for communications and for weapons.
Weapons, right.
State-of-the-art and evolution of high-energy laser weapons, we've seen those. They're now being deployed on ships. The USS Ford, our new aircraft carrier, has them on there as well.
I remember the very beginning when, when Reagan had Star Wars, people said, you're out of your mind. This cannot happen. Well, let me tell you, it is happening.
Oh, and it was happening.
That's right.
And these guys said, I mean, you said you worked there, you went places, and you heard people saying, hey, Larry, no matter what they tell you, there's a lot more going on than they're admitting.
Oh, yeah.
That's what these guys said. They said the Harvest program. They said, and a handful of people have probably ever heard of the Harvest program.
I'd never heard of it.
I hadn't until they mentioned to me. You always hear rumors of things they're working on this or doing that, but I never heard the term Harvest program. Maybe it's, and they didn't tell me when we did the book. All of a sudden now they're
interesting, because you think of harvesting organs and things when you think of harvest, right?
We're harvesting technology, but some of this technology is alive. Laser lightcraft nanosatellites. Those are beautiful.
What is that exactly?
Well, first of all, a nanosatellite's a small satellite.
Very tiny.
Yeah, sometimes I call them CubeSats. They tend to be smaller. But instead of launching them into space using some type of a combustion system, they're launched into space using a laser. So they can be taken in an aircraft up to the high level. They're released from the aircraft. The laser then propels them up into space.
Wow.
So we're using laser. We're using light energy.
They were just used recently. I can't remember exactly.
They just did some stuff with these. But you're not talking about the Chinese who lost a satellite, right? Because we know nothing about that.
Yeah, what was that about?
And neither does Great Britain.
What was that about? We don't know anything about that.
Oh, that's too bad. What happened?
Yeah.
You remember the movie The Hunt for Red October?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
At the end, he's sitting there and he goes, "You lost another submarine?"
Exactly.
We don't know anything about
Right.
it. I'm not saying that we do, but these nanosatellites, their mission is to do this type of thing, is to observe other satellites, get close to other satellites.
Are they cloaked or something?
They can be.
I see.
Now we're getting into we're going to talk about that in a second, but we're going to talk about cloaking.
Okay.
And I'll mention. Make me remind you of something of the cloaking. So we have laser-like nanosets, biosensors, and biomems. These are electronics that we're trying to place into biologic entities.
Really?
Okay, so they might be nanotechnology, but we want. Here's one of the first applications, which is a soldier. We want to know before a soldier is sick out there on the field. We want to know when he or she is getting sick. We want to know when they're injured. We want to know how injured they are, because the soldier's going to keep going. I'm fine, I'm going to keep going. They're going to be able to implant these devices. And when I say implant, they're not a big deal. And then biologically hear back.
Fix them.
Are we using these on the animals, like how we do the identification of a pet?
It's beyond that.
It's
beyond
so
that.
beyond that.
Communicating. It's the biological entity is communicating with electronics.
Wow.
Okay, directly communicating with electronics. Now, part of that's going to be, and we're going to mention it in a minute, is actually communication, perhaps, with a craft. Can we fly a craft without touching it? Can we think about it? Can we make it fly?
Like Spock.
And that's where the biosensors come in. Invisibility cloaking, you just mentioned that.
Yeah.
We've always had what we call virtual cloaking, or we've had that for a number of years, which we think may have come from, but that's an electronic type of cloaking, what you see with the stealth aircraft. Now we're getting into actual cloaking, where you can't see it. And it was interesting because, and whether you like him or not, that's not the issue here. The president was speaking, this was a couple months back, to a group of veterans. And he was proud to tell them that we're moving forward. We're making this country more safe. And that's what they want to hear, because some of their lives, they had friends who gave up their lives to that. And he said to them, we even have an airplane you can't see.
I see.
And he said that. We're not talking radar. We're talking you can't see it. And I know that's been worked on. High frequency gravitational wave communications, anti-gravity, biomaterials.
Biomaterials.
Okay. Metallic glass was one of their projects. This is glass that behaves like metal. Maybe that's what was at Roswell.
Is that the advantage, that one can see through it? Is that why it's...
You can see through it. It can be more pliable. It can be more durable to heat. It can
It's resistant.
It's resistant to a lot more things, like the tiles on a space
Glass is
shuttle.
more resistant than metal.
To heat.
To
sometimes.
heat.
Wow.
That's what we had on the bottom of the space shuttle.
Wow.
So I can go through a number of these that they did. Here's one of my favorite. Limb-operated interface. Limb-operated interfaces operated in a non-limb environment.
Oh my dear.
Say that again.
Operate an interface to operate things without limbs.
Yeah.
So not using my limbs to operate.
So you're using your mind.
And where did that come from?
Telepathic.
Right.
Roswell. They had these bands.
They found bands.
They found
Okay.
They found headbands.
Okay. All right.
Really?
So now there's a number of technologies also currently used by DARPA. Engineered Living Materials Project. These are materials made out of living matter. We're doing that today. Radio bio. That's where we have biologics, using radio waves, electromagnetic fields to communicate directly with other electronics. Neural engineering system design. Brains that can communicate electronically.
So are we actually, if we're able to say that we have this, do we have two people that are actually sitting and being able to communicate at this point, or is this just theory?
No, they're doing this, and
No,
this is
they're
DARPA. This is public now. This is public knowledge. Implantable neural dust.
Yeah, that one I had to go look up.
Did you find it?
They put it in a rat's, and I'm like, that was the first thing. I'm like, what is implantable neural dust?
It's actually nanotechnology.
It's a dust particle.
Particles
so
are
small.
nanotechnology, yeah, and it can communicate.
Oh man, that's wild. So that could be actually put into the air.
Right.
And people could breathe it, and the entire population of the mind could be under control. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's a little uncomfortable, isn't it?
Superman memory crystals, the crystals that were found at Roswell, we now can do all this. So all these things we're doing, and I've said the reverse engineering project was eventually dubbed Harvest, and often there was references to what they call the boneyard. So all this came pretty much from Roswell, and we could go on for another hour on this.
Yeah, there's a lot
And
with
break
this.
down each one of these
Just to give the public an idea, all that came out of this Roswell event is really unbelievable.
Yep.
Groundbreaking, history breaking. It's like on the map of human history, Stone Age, Iron Age, Age of Wood. This is was an age.
The missing link in the
difference.
technological age?
You got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
We
Wild.
see jumps that are just beyond belief.
Yep.
And I'll tell you, Rick, tonight's show was maybe one of the most interesting shows we talked about. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And believe me, if we want to hear from you, please email us at theviewshow at AOL.com. We would love to talk about the subject and get back to you with any questions you might have. And I want to thank you, Kat, for coming here tonight. You've been excellent, and hopefully we'll be doing this in the future.
Thanks, loved it.
Rick, thank you. As usual, you're right on your game.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you and good night.